Well, good morning. If you're not already there, Acts chapter 17 will be our home base for this morning. It has been such a joy to be together, to be able to sing, to worship, to edify one another. It's my prayer that you have been encouraged, and I would encourage you to not leave here burdened. If you've come here with a heavy heart, something on your mind, please let us know. We want to be able to pray with you, pray together, and love you in any way that you need. As you're turning to Acts chapter 17, I want to begin by introducing you to two missionaries. The first missionary is from this century, and the second missionary is from last century. The first one, his name is Craig Phillips, and he's a missionary in Nepal. And I met Craig just a year and a half ago or so when he was presenting about his work to me and a group of colleagues about what the Lord was doing over in that region of the world. And he was sharing a story about how he came into this work and how God led him and moved him to this mission work in Nepal. You see, he was actually visiting another missionary in Nepal and had no interest in doing any sort of long-term mission work, but he wanted over there and he wanted to go and visit this missionary over there. And while he was there, he caught a vision. He would rise early each morning for morning prayer and a devotion with this missionary, and they had this routine. Each morning they would say these prayers and they would spend some time in scripture. And then after they were done with this, after they're done with this worship, they would then go down to the religious square where they would see hundreds of their neighbors, hundreds of people coming for their morning worship around all sorts of these Hindu idols. And they would go back and forth each morning, rotating, spending time worshiping the Creator God of Scripture, and then going and seeing this idolatry worship down the road. And each morning, the missionary would reflect with Craig and say, how are you feeling? How are you feeling? He says, this isn't right. And he felt this burden developing and building. And then at the end of the time, he asked this question to Craig, said, how are you feeling? He said, this is not right. And he said, what are you going to do about it? And that was it. The rest was history. Him and his family moved over there, and they've been over there for decades. What are you going to do about it? As I said, he had no intention of ever spending his life as a missionary working in Nepal, but he was cut to the heart, and he saw what God was up to, and he saw people who were lost, bowing down to idols, and he developed a burden, developed a passion, because he saw people worshiping false gods. He was moved to action and moved with compassion. Now, the second missionary, he was a missionary in India in the 20th century, and his name was Lesslie Newbigin. He was from Great Britain, and he spent 40 years of his life doing mission work in India. And after returning to the United Kingdom, Newbigin was burdened with this important question that guided the rest of his life and the rest of his research as a scholar. And the question was this: how might the church have a missionary encounter with the West? That was what was burdening him. You see, he went over to India as a missionary, and he had his missionary training, learning about the culture in India, learning about the religion in India, learning about the worldview in India, the language in India, the assumptions and the beliefs and the longings, and having eyes to see what was behind the scenes in these people. And so he said, what would it look like if I was to be here for the first time? If I was to move to the West, move to, in his case, to Europe for the first time, how might I engage our culture as a missionary? How might I have a missionary encounter? How might the church have a missionary encounter with the West? And in his research, he made a surprising discovery, and that was this: that Western religion was not all that different from India. You see, on the outward appearance, it sure seemed like it. We don't have this type of worship in our culture, where you have hundreds of little idols, where you have morning routines bowing down to them. But what he realized was that we do, in fact, while we prize ourselves on being a secular society in the West, we actually have millions and millions of gods we bow down to every single day. So we live in a culture that is full of idols. We live in a world where our neighbors, our families, our friends, our coworkers are bowing down and worshiping thousands and thousands of idols, looking for meaning and love and fulfillment in things that cannot satisfy. And so the question we need to ask ourselves is this: are we burdened by this? In the same way that Craig was burdened by this false worship in Nepal, and that moved him to action, moved him to encounter a people and bring the Creator God and the resurrection of Jesus to this people who were bowing down to false idols. As he was burdened, are we burdened? Are we burdened by the idol worship that's all around us, that's seeped within our culture, seeped within our relationships, seeped within our entertainment, seeped within our own families? Are we burdened by this when we see people bowing down to things that are not God? I want you to consider the heart of Jesus in Matthew chapter 9. Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. He encounters the crowds. He sees them wandering in circles, lost, chasing all sorts of things. He sees that they are like sheep without a shepherd, and it moves him to compassion. It moves him to prayer. It moves him to action. And so this morning, I want us to think about this question. This question will serve as our guiding question for our sermon this morning. How do we, church, engage our neighbors in a culture full of idols? How might we engage the neighborhood in a culture and in a world that is filled with idol worship? As we look out at our neighbors, as we look out at our friends, what do we see? Do we see relatively good people going about their business? Or do we see idols in their tight grip? Do we see our neighbors' inner longings that are being crushed by gods that cannot satisfy? Church, are we burdened by the idol worship that exists all around us? And if so, what are we going to do about it? Well, what we're going to learn is what we've already had read to us this morning. This is not new, and this has existed since the dawn of time, where man tries to find longing and find meaning and find their desires satisfied in things that cannot provide life. And we're going to look at the example of Paul in Athens in Acts chapter 17. And as we look at Acts 17, we're going to consider three important steps that we might take as a church if we want to really engage the neighborhood. And the first one is this. Step one, we need to spend time walking around the neighborhood. Now, before we read Acts chapter 17, I want to remind you where we are as Paul arrives in Athens. In Acts chapter 17, Paul and his companions have been successfully sharing the gospel both in Thessalonica and in Berea, but have also been attacked and persecuted by Jewish leaders and run out of town quickly. And so we see perhaps Paul is in a place where he wasn't anticipating. It almost seems like, yes, Paul's in Athens, but maybe that wasn't plan A. Maybe he intended to spend more time in Thessalonica or spend more time in Berea, watering and strengthening the disciples. But he was run out quickly. He finds himself in Athens, and he's just sort of waiting for his companions to arrive. Athens at this time was the cultural capital of the world. It wasn't the power capital anymore since Rome had taken over Greece, but it was still the intellectual and the cultural capital of the world. You see, this is where ideas about the world were formed. This is where art, this is where beauty were expressed. This is where things were created and things were discussed and ideas were meditated on and discerning and learning was taking place. Back in 2014, I had the privilege of going on a mission trip with a group of teens, and we were able to spend some time in Athens. And I remember standing on Mars Hill where this speech from Paul takes place. And what I found interesting was that from this hill, you could look two ways. On the one hand, you could look out over Athens and you can see the entire city, but then you could turn around and on the highest point you could see the Parthenon. And it was almost like this Parthenon, and I think this was intentional, cast this shadow over the entire city. And to me that symbolized everything. And that symbolized maybe some of the feelings that Paul was feeling when he arrives in Athens, when he saw idols everywhere, this shadow looming over this people. And so in Acts chapter 17, starting in 16 and 17, this is what we read just a moment ago, that while Paul was waiting for them, that's his companions at Athens, his spirit was provoked. He became stirred up. He had that feeling that you have when you know something's not right, kind of in your gut. He was moved and stirred to even anger. It was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. We'll come back to that in a moment. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. So when Paul is provoked by the state of this city, what does he do? Well, first, as is his custom, he goes to the Jews and the God-fearers in the synagogues. But notice that Paul does not only go where it's comfortable. I would imagine that this would be a comfortable place for him to go. As a person who grew up, a Pharisee of all Pharisees, devout Jew, this was his people. They spoke his language, right? We know each other. And sometimes I tend to fall back on something that is comfortable when I'm put in a position that's uncomfortable, right? I remember being in South Africa during my time with Adventures in Missions, and we'd go to work with this congregation every week in Fairview Church of Christ in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. But every once in a while we'd have visitors from the States. And I would remember being in a crowd, everyone's talking. It would be, during fellowship time when you can hardly even hear yourself think and people are just talking over each other. Across the room, if I heard an American accent, I see it. Where are you? That's my friend. Come here, let's talk. Sometimes that's kind of how we are wired to fall. If I'm uncomfortable, if I'm in a position where I'm out of my own element, maybe it's tempting to default to what is comfortable. But Paul doesn't just stay there. He recognizes that's step one. He talks about this strategy in Romans chapter 1 to the Jew and then to the Greek. So he goes to the synagogue, but then what happens? He goes to the marketplace. In the middle of Athens, you would find the agora, the marketplace. And it's, I think, pretty hard for us to get our minds around what exactly the marketplace was like in the ancient world. You see, absolutely everything happened in the marketplace. Anything you needed to get done, anything you needed to buy, anything you needed to do could be found in the marketplace. Yes, they had temples, but they also had law courts. They had state offices. They had public archives. They had libraries. They had shops, concert halls, dance halls, gymnasiums, theaters, and galleries. In other words, everything, and more importantly, everyone was there in the marketplace. And this is where Paul decides to go. He walks around the marketplace, and we might use the language of walks around the neighborhood if we're going to apply this to our own life. He walks around the marketplace, and it apparently just starts talking to people. And that's maybe a foreign thought to us in a social media driven world. I don't want to look at anybody. You go into an elevator, what do? Pull out your phone? I can't talk to you, No, not so. What does Paul do? He goes to the marketplace and he just starts talking to, it says, every day with those who just happen to be there. You see this sort of organic walking around, discerning what God is up to, and having conversations with people, and more importantly, sharing the gospel with people, with those who just happened to be there. So I don't want you to overlook the importance of what Paul does here. You see, he's burdened by what's happening in the city. He's burdened and he's provoked by the idols he sees in the city, and he decides to do something about it. And what does he do? He doesn't have some clean-cut strategy. He just goes and he just starts talking to people, and the Lord works with whoever happens to be there. Now, you don't have to raise your hand and confess this before everybody, But how many of you would consider yourselves a people watcher? When you go maybe to a mall or to a public place, Bart raised his hand. He's a people watcher, right? We go, and you ever done that where you sit on a bench and you just happen to just look at what's happening around you, just see, you can learn a lot about somebody just by observing. They don't even have to speak. Just learning, looking at how they're moving and how they're interacting and how they're interacting with their families and their social network. You can learn a lot about someone just by watching, just by observing. And this might seem like an odd thing to say, but I would say that there's power in spiritual people watching. If you look at people and you really pay attention, you'll discover all sorts of things. You'll discover things that they might believe. You'll discover things they might fear. You might discover things that they long for, things that they desire. Over this last summer, we had several mission teams come up to do work up here around the state of Alaska, and one of the groups went down to Homer for a few days. And one of the exercises we did with these teens is we spent an afternoon, we broke up into groups, and we went on what I called a Jericho walk, where we went down different neighborhoods in small groups, and we just started praying over houses. We didn't know, sometimes we would interact with people if they're outside, but I wanted these teens to learn how to just pray with their eyes open, to discern what is God up to. You can learn a lot if you pray with your eyes open and to catch a vision that God is up to something. And how might we partner with what God is already doing? What is their story? What do they long for? What questions are they burdened by? And you can learn a lot about where someone is just by paying attention and getting out of your own routine. So that's the first step. It's just spending time walking around the neighborhood. In other words, spending time looking and listening and observing what is going on in the lives of my neighbor. And then step 2, we need to spend time identifying idols. Identifying idols. So in verse 22, it says that Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive," pay attention to that word, "I perceive that in every way you are very religious." So I want you to notice 3 things about this. First, we already saw back in verse 16, the text says that Paul, quote, saw that the city was full of idols. Now, this almost doesn't need to be said. I want you to imagine being Luke's readers. They know what Athens is all about, right? They know what happens in Athens. They know there's idols. Why make this point? The word used here is more than just seeing with the eyes, more than just happening to observe something happening. It's discernment. He sees that something's going on here. The word theoreo is where we get the word theorize. It's not only to see, but to take in, to observe, to meditate on, to discern, and to think about, and to consider. Perception, discernment. So in other words, it's not just that Paul sees the idols, that's obvious. He sees and he looks even deeper. That idols and idol worship is at the bottom of absolutely everything in Athens. And all these conversations he's having and all of these structures that he sees, idol worship is at the bottom of everything. You see, idols are not just objects that one bows down to. They lie beneath everything. In other words, idols are not simply bad things. They are good things that are twisted into ultimate things. Good things twisted into things that trick us into thinking that we can find fulfillment in life in them. So when good things, business, art, friendships, family, sex, etc., are looked at as ultimate and looked at as things that can fulfill me and create identity, as that which gives one purpose and shapes one character, then that good thing becomes an idol. An idol, a god that crushes us. And so this is why Paul says in verse 22 here, I perceive, which is the same word as verse 16. I see, or I perceive that you are very religious. He sees that at the bottom of Athenian culture, they are chasing ultimate meaning in things that will not provide life. And this is the terrible danger of idolatry. It's putting one's hope and trust in things that have no power to give life. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I want you to notice how Paul responds in verse 16. Verse 16 says that his spirit was provoked within him. We just looked at that a moment ago. I want you to imagine waking up one morning and you walking out to your car and you're about to leave to go to work for the day, and you look over in your neighbor's yard and you see your neighbor just out in the yard just bowing down to a 6-foot-tall golden statue and worshiping a golden statue. How might you respond? You probably have some emotions build up and say, well, what are you doing, right? And you might speak into that. You might try to address that. You might have a conversation. It might provoke you to have a certain feeling and provoke you to have some action, like our missionary friend in Nepal. You would probably catch a bird and say something or do something about it. But I want you to think about this. Our neighbors, our family, our friends, our coworkers are all doing this every day. Everyone worships something. We're wired to worship. That's why it's built in the first commandment of the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me, because we're wired to worship, because we're created. And if you're created, you are built with longings for things that are higher than you. And so how would you respond? How might that make you feel? It says Paul was provoked within him. He was stirred up, moved to anger. So remember, we read a moment ago in Matthew chapter 9, verse 36, that Jesus was moved to compassion. You see, Jesus' compassion and Paul's anger that he's feeling are not too far apart, because they're both indicators that something's not right. They're both indicators that something's not right here. I need to do something about it. So are we moved when we see this? When we see people chasing things that are crushing them, does it create within us compassion? Does it provoke within us this feeling of, I got to say something, I've got to do something about it? So that's the second thing. He says he was provoked within him. And then the third thing, it says that he reasoned with him back in verse 17. Paul reasoned with them. Yes, his spirit was provoked, but he didn't attack them. He didn't slap them upside the head. He didn't yell, turn or burn, ye sinners. He reasoned with them. He listened to them, and then he offered them a better way. And this is why he recognizes and he acknowledges right where they are by saying, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. You see, sometimes it's easy for us to assume that people who aren't Christians are automatically resistant, apathetic, or oppose the gospel. And this is certainly true for some people. Some people are hard soil. But Jesus says in Matthew chapter 9, after what we read a moment ago, that the harvest is plentiful. It's the laborers who are few. He assumes that people all around him are ripe for the harvest, are ready to respond. That's the optimism with which Jesus sees the crowds that are running in circles, sheep without a shepherd. Is that how we view people? The fact is, there are people considering spiritual things all around us. And that's why this spiritual but not religious group is the fastest growing religious group in our country. There are people trying to find meaning in life. There are people all around us who we might, like Paul, say, that person is very religious. They might disagree with you, but they might be very religious. It's just that perhaps they don't have a full picture yet. Perhaps they don't recognize that there is one God who's created all things. Maybe they don't recognize that this God became flesh and died for their sins. Maybe they don't realize that this crucified Christ has been raised from the dead. Maybe they haven't connected the dots yet. Maybe their longings haven't been connected to what can actually fulfill them, which is why it's vital that we go from walking around the neighborhood, spend time identifying idols, but thirdly, and most importantly, connecting them to Jesus. Because if we just see and we say, how sad is that? That's the James scenario, right? Be warmed and filled. We need to do our part in helping, we can't force, but helping people connect their longings and their desires to Jesus, the one and the only one who can ultimately satisfy. And that's what Paul does. Notice, for as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, quote, to the unknown God. They had so many gods, they had one just to cover all the bases, just in case we missed one, right? To the unknown God. Instead of Paul slamming them, instead of Paul beating them upside the head, he takes that as a starting point, as an entry point, and connects that longing to what can ultimately satisfy. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. You don't realize it, but you're worshiping something that you have not seen yet. You have not realized yet. And what you worship as unknown, let me tell you all about it. And as you go on and you read the rest of this interaction in Athens, Paul begins to connect this unknown worship to the Creator God, the only God. He connects it to a resurrected Christ, and we see that some doubted and some wanted to hear more. So after spending time in the neighborhood, watching and listening and reasoning, after spending time identifying idols at the bottom of everything in Athens, gripping the lives of both Jews and Greeks, Paul begins to connect their longings to Jesus. So in other words, it's not enough for me or for us to say, that's an idol, and then move on. Anybody can do that. Anybody can point fingers and says, that's an idol, and move on. That's not good enough. You see, that's what the turn or burn people do. Turn or burn. Just idol. They say that's a sin. They say that's sending you to hell without any hope or any good news. Not so with Paul. You see, Paul recognizes that these people he's speaking to are seeking something. They're all looking for something. They're all longing for something. And he connects that inner longing for something to the Creator God and to the resurrected Jesus. And that's our mission, to identify the idols that are gripping our friends, to discern the inner longings that they're longing for, and to connect those longings to a Creator God and to a resurrected Jesus. So what we want to say to our friends is this: friend, I see you're looking for something. Here it is. I see you're longing for something. Here it is. I see you're searching for meaning and purpose in X. Here it is. In other words, our job is not just to tear down idols. It very much is that, but it's easy to deconstruct. It's easy to tear down. It's much harder to build up. You see, it's one thing to deconstruct something, to tear it down, but our job is to demonstrate how these idols fail to provide hope in life, and then to redirect our friends to the only source of life there is, life that comes from the Father, the source of all life, life that comes through the resurrected Jesus, life that comes through the power of the Holy Spirit. And as you read the rest of the chapter, that's what Paul does. He tells them about the invisible God who created all things, and about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We see this dynamic really at play in the book of Ecclesiastes. You remember the wise preacher recounting all the things he's chased over his life? Vanity, he says in chapter 1, verse 2. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What an encouraging morning read for us, right? Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And he goes on and he spends chapter after chapter describing all the things he's chased in his life. He's chased wisdom, he's chased money, he's chased work, he's chased wisdom, he's chased women, and he describes it like chasing wind. You ever try to grab wind? You can't do it. He says it's like chasing wind. It's absolutely impossible. All is vanity under the sun. That's the key phrase in the book, under the sun. And it's not until the very end of the book, when he gazes above the sun at God himself and he begins to fear God, that anything begins to have meaning. In the same way, our friends and our families are trying to find life and purpose and meaning in things and in good things, but in created things. And if you try to find ultimate purpose in something that is created and not in the Creator, you have before you an idol that will crush you. And so what do? We lovingly and we prayerfully show them that what they are seeking can only be found in God. For example, we might say this: I know that you think that once you find the right job, that once you get promoted enough, once you make this much money, then you'll be happy and satisfied. I know that you think that drugs and alcohol will give you pleasure. I know that you think that sex without boundaries will give you satisfaction. I know you think that enough education and knowledge will make you a somebody. I know that you think that if you could just find the right partner to marry or just have one more kid, or if I can get my kids in that right school and get them involved in these extracurriculars, then I'll have done something meaningful. In other words, if I can have blank, if I can do blank, then I'll be happy. Then I'll have purpose. Then I'll have meaning in my life. Listen, our friends are being absolutely crushed by these idols. These good things cannot provide life, hope, or meaning by themselves. Alone they are vanity, vanity, all is vanity under the sun. Tim Keller helpfully defines an idol as this. He says, a counterfeit God is anything so central and essential to your life that should you lose it, your life would feel hardly worth living. I want you to think about that. What is it in your life that if you did not have it tomorrow, you would feel like your life was not worth living? You might have found your idol. Because idols grip us in all sorts of secret ways. And so like Paul, we must identify these idols and lovingly show our neighbors that what they're seeking is good. Purpose, meaning, hope, and love is good. You're wired and you have the desire built within you to seek these things, but these things cannot be found in powerless idols. They can only be found in the one God who's created all things, and they can only be found in Jesus, his Christ, crucified and risen. So church, I hope you're convinced this morning that we live in a world full of idols. And our culture prides itself on being, quote, non-religious. But make no mistake, our culture is just as religious or perhaps more religious than any other. We have gods all around us, idols all around us. And if we spend enough time in the neighborhood, if we spend enough time with our friends in their homes, if we spend enough time praying for eyes to see and ears to hear, we will see our neighbors that we love so dearly being crushed knowingly or unknowingly by things that cannot provide life. And if you really can see that, how might you respond? How might you feel? What actions might you take? And that's exactly why our news is called good. That's why our news is called good news. This is why we should, like Paul, be unashamed of the gospel. Remember that verse in Romans 1:16? I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. Question, do you believe that? Do you believe that the gospel is powerful? The very power of God, that the good news that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead to give us right relationship with the Creator God? Do you believe that that news is powerful? Do you believe it has the power to save, the power to provide life, the power to provide hope and meaning, all these things that our friends so longly desire? Do you believe in the power of the gospel? May we, like Paul, refuse to be content. May God's Holy Spirit convict us so deeply that these counterfeit gods all around us are no match for the one true Creator God, the Lord of heaven and earth. And may we have the courage to spend time in the neighborhood, talking, listening, reasoning with our friends. And may he give us the wisdom to connect our friends to Jesus, the good shepherd who lays his life down for the sheep. So I want to invite you this morning. This morning, if the Lord has put a burden on your heart and we can pray with you and pray for you, I would like you to come to the front during this next song. If an idol has been gripping you and you've been searching for life and meaning in something or someone that is not God, I want you to come forward. I want to invite you to come forward so we can pray on your behalf. If you're here this morning and you've not yet decided to follow Jesus, please know that there's nothing in this world that you can find life and purpose and meaning in other than Jesus Christ, who leads us back to the Father. If you want to be baptized this morning and commit your life to Christ, or if there's any way that we can pray for you and love you this morning, please come to the front as we stand and sing our invitation song together.